So I thought we could start with a quote that I pulled from your book. A soldier that has been hit in the chest by a bullet, face down on the ground. His pack has fallen on him and is pinning him in place. And he's just pretty convinced that he's going to die. Another Marine has come up to him. He's giving him some medical advice. Here he goes. That fear was there, Haney said, but you can work that fear if you can get a handle on it, which is very hard to do, but it can be done, and it can sustain you through things. You have to turn it around to where that's the only thing, You just have to accept where you're at, the position that you're in. I mean, you can cry about it all day long, but it's not going to do you any good. I knew where I was at. I knew I couldn't move. I knew they would get to me. And I knew it was just when. And the they there is, I think, the VC. He's convinced he's going to die. An incredible moment in this scene of mastering fear. I want to ask you to start off, Doyle, what inspired you to become an author in this way?
That's a great question. It goes way back to my first visit to the Alamo, and the book it was a book by Lon Tinkle called 13 Days to Glory or something like that. And as a young kid, looking at these guys that fought a battle to the death, and the lion and the sword, the myth, the mythology around that, fighting for their country and values, and then they all get wiped out. I was enamored. For whatever, young boy, I just thought that bravery is what being a man was all about, and that's I wanted to reach that level. So life goes on. Go to law school, become a prosecutor, put bad guys away. And then, fast forward, there was always that nagging desire to tell these stories that are here with us, that are so important to all of us, growing up, and who we want to be, who we want to emulate, what values we want to have as people. And, going to church and being the right person and doing all these things, I still had that nagging feeling is that we're missing something. I mean, culturally, these stories need to be told. So I sculpted 2 monuments to honor Medal of Honor recipients, one in Kentucky, one in Texas, and I was taken in by those stories. Then I realized, well, you can't sculpt monuments of everything, but there are a million stories that need to be told. Around that time, we're talking the 1990s, early 2000s, we as a country are honoring our greatest generation. We have Band of Brothers, we have Saving Private Ryan, World War II Memorial, HBO miniseries The Pacific. As well, we should honor our men and women that served in World War II to fight evil, so that you and I can talk today in freedom. I mean, we're here because of what they did. I mean, we can never forget that we are where we are, you and I, with our freedom and our coffee and on our podcast, because they died and bled so that we would not live under a totalitarian regime where we did not have our freedom. We can never forget that. And that goes all the way back to the Revolution, Civil War, all the way forward. We're here, we have our liberty because of them. So I realized I grew up during the Vietnam War. I was too young to serve, but I remember the broadcast every night, Walter Cronkite coming on and talking about it. I remember how we left that conflict, and I remember how poorly our veterans were treated by Americans when they returned, having tomatoes thrown at them, called baby killers, and then forgotten, and just simply forgotten. Fast forward, we're now in 2025. I started these interviews over a decade ago. We've already lost half of the people that I spoke with. So that we're in the same position as we were with the greatest generation now, with the Vietnam generation. And a war that people don't know much about. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There's still an attitude of forgetting and even mixing them up with the Korean War with the younger generation. And more importantly, we don't have the stories from Vietnam, the Vietnam War, that we have from World War II. There are a lot more stories, and you can dive into specific elements of heroism, gallantry in that conflict because it's a war we won. Vietnam, it's not out there. And when I first made the step to start interviewing people, and it was for my first book, Lions of Medina, there's nothing out there other than the veterans who were there. And it became almost a rush to at least get some of these stories recorded while I could. And that was the genesis. So it goes all the way back to early stories, you know, the Alamo, Thermopylae. I mean, just back to the ancients as you study to now. And how we can't overemphasize how important knowing what that was about from Haney's level. Howard Haney facing down in the rice paddy with that pack on his back and a bullet in his chest, knowing he's going to die. What's going through his mind? How does he handle that? That quote that you quoted from him illustrates everything. I mean, look at the lesson that you and I can learn today in the morning in the comfort of our offices from what he felt and about fear and how to handle fear. I mean, what a great lesson. I guess it boils down to we need these stories. We need this truth for all of us. And when these men pass away, their stories pass away with them.
Yeah, it's really urgent. I think a lot of thoughts came to mind as you were talking. One is that it's interesting that Plutarch often, the biographer that I base most of my episodes on, he is always talking about, he always kind of drawing this comparison between sculpture and biography, how he is forming an image of the character of a man, much like a sculptor would. And, but his idea is that he's forming an image of the soul. So I think, you know, you get something different from a physical monument than you do from a story. But there's a lot of interesting parallels there classically. And I think one of the things that is talked about at length by many moral philosophers, I think C.S. Lewis has a great quote on this. It's not coming to mind the exact wording of it right now, but how, you know, there are many virtues, justice, temperance, cleverness, wisdom, but the foundation of all the virtues that makes all of them possible is courage. And I think this is one thing that you see just constantly. And it's one of the things that I tell people, that one of the things you get out of reading war stories or stories of great men of action, great souls of action, is they encourage you. Very literally, they you hear the story and you kind of imagine a better version of yourself that matches the deed that you've seen, and in a small way, you know, when we're in peacetime. But so I think that really comes through. So why don't you take us, and I want to return to the Haney part a little later, because there's some really interesting Stoic reflections about how death, certainty of death, frees you and gives you peace. The really interesting reflections from the soldiers on that. But before we get there, why don't we paint the scene a little bit of, so the book is Swift Sword. It's mainly about September 4th. Is that right? 1967 is the day that this incredible battle happens. Could you situate us just generally in the Vietnam War for those who aren't Vietnam War buffs? I mean, it's kind of hazy for me as well, so I'd appreciate it too.
Sure. And I just hit thumbnail, and I may miss some important details, but you know, overall, in 1967, we're in the middle of the Cold War. So, first obvious thing is you have nuclear missiles from the Soviet Union and China, and then the West, all pointed at each other, with the threat of worldwide mass destruction. So, first off, that means you cannot fight a war like you did World War II, all out, or at least it puts limits on that because of the threat. So we have a situation in Vietnam where you have a communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, allied with China and Russia. Therefore, he is wanting to consolidate all of Vietnam under his realm, step back. Well, that's the spread of communism. We don't want that, which is very valid. We don't want totalitarian regimes expanding. What do? Well, we go fight for this democratically elected government in South Vietnam to prevent that spread of communism. The problem is it's much more complicated than that. The Vietnam War for the Vietnamese people was a war of independence against imperialistic regimes as they viewed them. Ho Chi Minh originally, back in the 50s, even approached the Western democracies, really didn't get very far, and then got support then from the communist regimes and then went down that path. Not knowing really know your enemy. I think that's one of the key tenets of the art of war. We didn't really know our enemy in Vietnam as well as we should have. We painted it more in a black and white type of way, which created all sorts of problems with who's our friend and who's our enemy on the ground. So we have Marine and Army units in Vietnam supporting the army of the South Vietnamese, the ARVN as they were called, to maintain their independence and not be taken over by the North Vietnamese. The war in 1967 is starting to become unpopular in the United States. We have, young men coming back in body bags. What are we doing? Reports of atrocities. Things are starting to go south for the American people, who are weary of our young men coming back dead, which that would worry anybody. So they're limited units. The Marine unit in the Khe Sanh Valley that we're talking about, the battalions and the divisions, had to have control over a large area. So they would go from area to fight, but then have to give up ground because there's simply not enough troops to occupy the entire Khe Sanh Valley of South Vietnam. The war is becoming unpopular at home. The North Vietnamese are like, okay, how can we win this? This is when thoughts of the Tet Offensive in early 1968 start coming about, and they get on the very valid idea the South Vietnamese can't win without the Americans. How do we defeat the Americans? We keep killing them, and the people at home are going to turn against the war, and they'll withdraw, which is exactly, ultimately, at the end of the day, what happened. So the strategy worked. It was kind of just draining blood from America until we became tired of the war. So in preparation for the Tet Offensive in late 1967, the Vietnamese are planning multitude attacks in South Vietnam to create that weariness, to show that they are not being beaten, and to really kind of push America out of the war because of that weariness that ultimately happened. That was, in the Khe Sanh Valley, that was part of the plan. The North Vietnamese were brought in the 2nd NVA, North Vietnamese Army Division, a veteran unit that had been rebuilt after earlier operations that had decimated it. And that's another thing to talk about. Tactically, the Marines and the soldiers, the Americans won most of the battles tactically. It's this overall strategy that that there were some issues with. So on September 3rd, 1967, there are free elections for the president in South Vietnam. Marine units are out to protect voters from harassment from the Viet Cong, which are kind of the guerrilla units working in South Vietnam, and even the NVA, the formal army. And what happens is that on the night of those elections, September 3rd, a company of Marines constitutes roughly back then 150 to 160 men. One company, Delta 15, had been protecting South Vietnamese voters at the polls. Nighttime comes and they bed down near a river, the Lily River, in the region we're talking about. And Another company is nearby, Bravo. What happens is that the North Vietnamese launch a massive ambush. The army is there. The North Vietnamese army is there in massive numbers. They're outnumbering the Marines at least 3-1, maybe even more. And so they basically start a prelude to the Tet Offensive in preparation for that big offensive in January in the Khe Sanh Valley region. So they ambush the Delta 15 at night. Those men are about to be overrun. Bravo 15, another unit goes to help them. They get ambushed. Word goes out in the middle of the night. These men need help. We have to, and the Marines will tell you it's not a rescue operation. I mean, they just need assistance. They needed a lot of assistance. They were being overrun. Their perimeter was being pierced. So the word goes out to this is the 15, which is the 1st Marine Division, 5th Battalion. Word goes out to another battalion, 35. Our men need help. The company that I write about, Mike 35, 164 men, was on standby as a quick reaction force. They called it a bald eagle company to go out to wherever there is help needed immediately. So they were on standby at base. Word came out. Bravo and Delta 15 are in trouble. You guys have got to go out there. So 35 and another company, Kilo, are called to their aid. And that sets the stage for the battle, the first day of Operation Swift that I write about.
You know, something you were saying made me remember I was at an event recently with a gentleman named Jeffrey Race, who was a Navy intelligence officer, I think is what he was at the time. And he ended up writing a book called War Comes to Long On. And it's a very detailed military history. It's sort of almost sociological history of how the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese recruited the foot soldiers and kind of did state building and network building in the agricultural regions throughout the country, and kind of points to this issue that, you know, when you're fighting the Viet Cong, it's like you're in South Vietnam and you think you're fighting the Viet Cong, but you're just fighting the locals. The Viet Cong is the people there in a lot of these regions, and this is something right that you talk about as happening in the Khe Sanh Valley. You know, there's a scene when their Mike company comes up. You know, they've just been dropped off by the helicopter, and they approach this village. And there's this eerie silence, you know, like no people are around, and that gives you a really bad feeling if you have experience in Vietnam. When the people aren't around, that means, you know, something's happening, and probably because the locals in this village are you know, part of the resistance. So it's very complicated, difficult, dynamic fog of war going on there.
Absolutely, and from the viewpoint of an 18-year-old Marine,
yes,
that's a lot to take on when your buddy gets killed next to you and you're facing death at each moment. That's a lot.
Yeah,
that's a lot,
man. Well, so give us a little overview of the battle, and I want to, maybe we won't get into the play by play of everything that happened, but and then zero in on some lessons and some stories. But before we get there, give us like a overview of like what happens exactly when Mike Company 35 comes in for this relief mission. How does the battle start?
Great question. So early morning, September 4th, and first I want to give you a quick sketch of the challenges, and I'll do that from the company commander, who was a lieutenant, J.D. Murray. Usually a company is commanded by a captain, but because of attrition in the ranks, he was commander of Mike 35. And one of the reasons that he was appointed is that he had combat experience. A lot of these men, in fact, the majority of them and the officers did not. So having combat experience and willing to go back into combat was very, very valuable. And that's why you saw a lot of guys re-up in Vietnam, because it saved lives if they knew what they were doing. So, but you had Lieutenant Murray with combat experience. He had 3 platoon commanders The company is divided into 3 platoons, each of them fresh from the United States, fresh from the basic school, no combat experience. He didn't even really know them. He did not train them. The company was not able to train as a unit. In World War II, companies were sent over as units that having trained together, and the men knew each other. So that was the first challenge. Second challenge is you had the individual replacement system in Vietnam, where when a Marine is wounded or killed, he's individually replaced by a kid straight out of boot camp. Nobody trusts this kid. This kid is alone. He hasn't trained with anyone. So once again, you don't have that teamwork that's built in. You have inherent weaknesses in the system. Then the third key element is that you had a faulty weapon, that these Marines were supplied with. The M16 at that time would consistently jam. The Marines were told it was because they weren't cleaning the weapons properly. That wasn't true. So these men were covering their bags in plastic from their sea rations, wrapping them in towels, keeping them clean, because they had to rely on this weapon to not only win a battle, but to live themselves. So these are some of the challenges that Lieutenant Murray was facing when he was called in the early morning hours. You guys need to go now. Choppers are coming. And at another element, the choppers, and I can't recall the exact model, I think the Skyhook or Skyhawk, had been grounded for faulty tail rotors, and so they were crashing. So the Marines are going to faulty weapon, leadership issues, issues with the structure, and they knew they were about to get on these choppers that could just simply crash, not even be shot down, but crash. So those are the challenges that they're facing. But being Marines, being mostly men who volunteered to fight, and at this point in the war, these men are really fighting for themselves. They're fighting for their buddy next to them on their left and right, to do their duty to help save not only their lives, but their comrades' lives, because everybody depends on each other. That's really like, I need you to help me stay alive. I'm going to help you so that you can stay alive. But they do their duty. They're called out, and they basically rush to go on these choppers. Sand is kicking up into their weapons. Like I said before, they're covering them with the plastic from their sea rations, wrapping them in towels, and they load the choppers, and they fly out, and they're immediately landed in the wrong place. So that's the first thing. So we have the theme here is so many challenges against them, yet they do their duty and they find a way to succeed. What's the definition of success? To survive, to do your duty, to accomplish your mission. And that's what ultimately they did. So without getting into too much detail, I wanted to sketch that out for you.
Yeah, this M16 issue is so tragic. I mean, I had heard that it was a faulty weapon, but I mean, it seems like it's like a chemical issue. Maybe the inside of the barrel hasn't been chromed properly, and the gunpowder carbonizes, and there's just like, it's not a cleaning issue, and no amount of cleaning is going to make these guns fully functional, and it ends up costing lives, and as you catalog on the battlefield. But I think this guy, Lieutenant Murray, is a really inspiring figure from the story. And I think this is something that you point out, that he had the option, like officers, is this right, that they would take 6 months on, 6 months off, like non-combat duty versus combat duty. And he, for whatever reason, probably out of a sense of duty that lives were at stake, decided to forego his non-combat cycle. And in this particular conflict, he had re-upped as a combat officer voluntarily, and it put him in this position to do an amazing job of courage under fire and deft leadership. And if he hadn't have been there, who knows what would have happened. Did I get that right?
Oh, absolutely. And there are countless examples of that. Another one is a veteran by the name of Larry Peters, who had a second tour of duty. And he was a, quote, veteran at age 20 or, something like that. And his experience at the non-commissioned officer level, the sergeant, is just, it illustrates so many examples of this heroism and courage and duty that don't get told. That's one thing I want to emphasize now, is that highlighting these stories is a way to shine the light on all these other stories that are out there that just simply the bandwidth to try to tell. But it became, for them, I have knowledge. For Murray, my lieutenants that are coming in don't have that knowledge yet. They don't have that experience yet. I can save lives here. If you had a captain come in fresh from the United States in this particular situation, no offense to that individual, but he'll probably get killed and get everybody else killed because he just doesn't have the combat experience. Lieutenant Murray had that.
Yeah. And this distinction between veterans and new recruits is just so important in so many battles in the ancient world. Same dynamic, when Caesar fights against Pompey, he's maybe outnumbered in terms of forces, but he's got veteran forces that have been fighting with him for 9 years in Gaul when the Civil War breaks out. And it's just, as Cicero points out in the letter, he's like, Caesar's army might be smaller, but it is incomparably superior for this very reason, that these men know each other. They know how to fight. They've had years. They're veterans. It's like the NFL versus a high school football team. And so, and this is a really big problem when they get dropped off in the wrong place, and they go in, and the people that they end up facing, that end up ambushing them, the NVA, are battle-hardened veterans, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And once again, from the get-go, from the very beginning, you see Lieutenant Murray's leadership and his veteran experience, because they get dropped into the wrong spot, so they're, quote, lost. They have to go find Delta and Bravo 15. He has barking in his ear a battalion commander from, not his battalion commander, but from 15. Basically, you're not in the right spot. What's going on? And so Murray has to figure out immediately what to do. So he fires a white phosphorus round, which is used in combat, but also it puts off white smoke, onto the position of where he needs to be according to the coordinates. He can see where he's at, and then he sets off. So immediately he improvises and, realizes he's going in the wrong direction, changes course, and is able to go into the right direction. In the meantime, the NVA, as you well point out, are veterans. A lot of them are from the Quezon region. They're locals, so they know the region has tunnels that are in place. Obviously the locals know what to do so that they can basically set up an ambush. So first off, they're incredibly well camouflaged, even on a bright sunny day with some, shrubbery and tree lines, but then open rice paddies. They're able to camouflage themselves so well that they can't be seen. And what's happening now is that Mike 35, as they go toward 15 on the Lili River to relieve them, they're now about to be ambushed themselves with the same issue, outnumbered 3-5-1, and they're about to walk into a death trap.
Yeah, and it's almost worse than it ends up being, because they, if I'm remembering correctly, they kind of they trigger the ambush before they're fully in the most vulnerable position. Like they're not quite in the net before the point man, this guy Swan, sees some rustling in the bushes, and then at some point you realize all the bushes are just camouflaged VC fighters, which is just
right.
That these people are like grown out of the land. I mean, it's really chilling. And so they manage to not totally be enveloped before a fighting breaks out. But once it starts, it's just hellfire almost instantaneously, right?
Yeah, if Jack Swan, and I want to talk about being a point man. Yeah. Once again, we're talking, I don't know exactly his age, but he's 20. the point man is the tip of the spear for the entire unit. If somebody's going to be killed and shot first, it's him because he's walking into the enemy. Jack Swan volunteered for this. He enjoyed it. He knew he was good at it. And as he is coming over a knoll into a large rice paddy, leading the company of men, and he sees the bush move, he yelled back to his squad leader, just saw a bush move. And the squad leader said, if it moves again, shoot it. He did. My point being, if they had made it out into that flat rice paddy, the entire company, we're talking Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. I mean, they would have been surrounded. The perimeter would have been pierced, and we wouldn't be here telling their story because we wouldn't know about it because they'd all be dead. But because Jack Swan saw what he did as the point man, they had a little bit of high ground. And as a military historian, you know the importance of any high ground. This knoll, it did not have a lot of cover as far as, shrubs or bushes. It had a little bit, but it was at least some high ground on which to establish a perimeter. The ambush got triggered early. The NVA attacked. They circled the wagons, and the fight was on from that point. One thing I want to point out is that even on that knoll, there were tunnels inside the perimeter that the North Vietnamese were able to come up and attack the Marines from inside their own perimeter, which is also chilling as well. So that's kind of the stage that's set, and suddenly it's live or die. I mean, are we going to live or are we going to die? And these decisions have to be made immediately in the moment. And to their credit, these Marines prevailed because they were up to living to that moment. And a lot of it was luck, but a lot of it's coordination with air support, all parts of the armed forces. But that's where we're at, is that the ambush gets triggered early. They're on the knoll and the fight is on.
Yeah. And a lot of the same principles apply to battle, the element of surprise, high ground, also establishing a perimeter, not letting your enemy kind of get in between around the back of your lines. It's a hollow square formation is something that Xenophon harps on a lot as a battle formation. But so there's maybe we could start getting into some of the stories of the individuals
Sure.
who I found so compelling. One of them is this gentleman, this Catholic priest, Father Vincent Capodanno, who is a chaplain, and chaplains are not supposed to, at least not without authorization, join the troops in combat. But Capodanno, sort of without authorization, jumps on a helicopter with his guys and goes and joins the fight. Tell us a little bit about Father Capodanno.
Well, he was an amazing individual. And, one thing I want to touch on, you asked why I got involved with these stories, and you talk about souls and spirituality. I'm a very spiritual person, Christian, soulful, believe in the afterlife, from a lot of different levels. And that's where I think a lot of this springs from when you get back to its core, what our souls and what that means in this life, and what values do you want to be a better soul. So Father Capodanno was known as the Grunt Padre, and grunt is a term for Marines, the lowest private, meaning he cared about his men deeply, and he was also incredibly brave. He was ordered on that morning to stay with the company, a battalion headquarters back. I think it was Hill 51. There are two different hills involved. So he's ordered to stay back with the gear, in the rear with the gear. And he's like, I'm not going to do that. My job is to be with my men, to tend to their souls, to help them. I know how scared they are. So,
and you also, sorry to interrupt, but these guys really have a feeling that this is not going to be a good day. Like something is wrong and something big is going to happen. There's this almost like sixth sense that a lot of these guys get. And you wonder if he kind of got it too. Like this might be the big one.
I think he Absolutely. He did, and his men did. I mean, they're quotes. Fred Tankey talking to the lieutenant colonel, can we do this? I mean, you're talking 3 to 4 to 1. What? How many thousands? What's going on? And Father Capodanno walks through the men as they're waiting for the choppers and talks to them. And he speaks. There's an account in there of one Marine that he's trying to console. So as they load up, he disobeys a direct order and stows away on one of the choppers. And the men look at him and they're going, what is the father doing here? He's not supposed to be here. That's the ones that see him is like, why is Father Capodanno here? He's going to get himself killed. And, why is he here? So he comes in, he joins the men. And then when this ambush hits, he is true to his faith and his word and to his mission, which is to see to the souls of his men, to care for them, to save lives. And as this firefight is going on this knoll with no cover, everybody's down for the most part. He is standing up, going from wounded Marine to wounded Marine, helping the corpsmen. And I can't say enough about the corpsmen. The Navy corpsmen were the medics. In the Army, they're medics. In the Marine Corps, they're called corpsmen, who provide that triage immediately to save lives when someone's immediately wounded. And it's a very dangerous position. 2 corpsmen were killed just on this one day. Father Capodanno was out helping the corpsmen and also providing last rites in his Catholic faith to those who were dying. And he is, at one point, when CS gas hits, he's giving his gas mask to one of the Marines. So his heroism immediately is amazing. And he's such a unique figure, as you well point out, in that he put his faith to the test and was with his men to the very end.
I'm going to try to say this without choking up. He's so, and he ends up indeed saving lives and probably saving souls and ministering the last rites and then losing his own in the process. And
and there's a great account. Fred Tankey, who just passed away, and I want to emphasize a lot of these guys we've lost them. Cancer, Agent Orange. These guys were walking through Agent Orange as a defoliant almost every day. And Fred just passed away. But he gives an account of how, as he's trying to drag this wounded corpsman up the knoll, Father Capodanno appearing out of nowhere as an NVA is pointing the machine gun right at Fred and laughing, smiling. It's like, I'm about to blow you away, son. And as he does that, Father Capodanno comes from behind to try to save Corpsman Leal. And in that process, the machine gun rips, Leal is killed, and then Father Capodanno is taken out right at that time. And then Fred scrambles back up and falls into a crater right at that time. So, yeah, it's a choke up moment. I mean, it's incredible. And my point and why I feel so strongly about what I'm doing is that Fred's passed away. If he had not been willing to talk with me and to get his story, we wouldn't have it. What I just accounted to you and why we're talking about it this morning and why it's so important for future generations, we wouldn't have it. I mean, these guys are passing away. So I'm very thankful to all these veterans who trusted me in telling their stories more than once, and so that I'm able, as just a scribe, to write it down and to preserve it and then get the word out, as we're talking about now, to help all of us.
Yeah, and you they really opened up, and there's many stories about just the power of faith on the battlefield. I think is fascinating, and I see this certainly in the ancient sources as well for the Greeks and Romans. But like there's a guy who's asked to be baptized because he thinks he's on his way out, critically wounded. He ends up pulling through, and a very inspiring story. There's a guy who has a vision of the enthroned God speaking to him on the battlefield. incredible.
And this is a kid. I mean,
Yeah.
this guy's a kid, and he sees that, and he's basically chastised. I mean, like, I'm everyone's God. What are you doing? Why are you fighting like this? But the words of
Yeah.
I am, it's very powerful, because if you go back and look at just the Christian scriptures, God says, "I am." This is where it goes way. We can go way into our souls and then project outward. But that vision, when he was telling me that, I'm going, wow, okay, I didn't expect this, and let's get this down so you and I could talk about it. And then Ed Combs, who's alive and lives in Ohio, he's that veteran who took a round to his chest that could have been a 50 caliber round. It opened such a hole in his chest that he could see his lungs. And he goes into that crater and he asks just a buddy, "Can you baptize me? Because I am not making it." "Well, I'm a Catholic." "Well, I'm not a Catholic. I don't care. I don't care. Just let's do this, because I'm on the way out, son." And he wasn't. But in that moment, he could have been. I mean, without a doubt. And that's where you get back into, and I can't say enough about in Vietnam, the medical situation of the doctors and the nurses and the corpsmen and the medics, because they were able to get in choppers to get these guys out and get them onto the medical ships, or at least to a field hospital somewhere. And that saved many lives, where you didn't really have that in World War II or as much in Korea. So that was an innovation that was positive. And we're talking about these medical choppers, medevacs coming in, braving machine gun fire from the NVA. They could get shot down themselves. So that bravery of those pilots can't be overemphasized again, to get these guys, on the medevac and to get them the help that they need. So, I want to talk about that as well. Another thing before I forget about it, we talked a little bit about arms and how air power was so important, calling in air power to beat back the North Vietnamese so that these Marines could live. You had the pilots in the Bird Dog, which is a Cessna flying over the battlefield. It's a little private airplane. So imagine artillery, bombs, guns, fire, NVA trying to shoot you down. They're the spotters to make sure that when you call in the bombs, you don't call it in on your own men.
Right.
You don't wipe out all of my company. That bravery, those accounts from those guys has to be talked about as well.
Yeah, and isn't there a moment where the pilots of one of these bird dogs are they're just so determined to keep serving the men on the ground in such a critical moment that the plane is like running out of gas, and they're like, "We could go back early and land the plane, but then these guys would be abandoned for however long. We're just going to stay out here in the field." And they end up, did they end up like crash landing?
He thought he was. He did make it back.
Okay.
Basically on vapors. On nothing. And there's a point where he thinks he's called in bombs on his own men, because there was an advancing company, of NVA coming right at the knoll. And he could see this from his vantage point in the Bird Dog. And, he has to, are these Marines? Is this help coming the way? Because you had another company, Kilo, out there. Could they be coming to help Mike 3-5? It gets very confusing up there in the moment. No, those are Vietnamese. Those are bad guys. But at one point, he thinks that he's annihilated 100 of his own men. And he dry heaved out the side of his small Cessna. But then it's confirmed that no, you hit the right guys. So imagine that tension, that pressure, that you're running out of fuel. You're going to crash. If you crash, even if you survive the crash, the NVA are going to shoot you and kill you. And when you land, they're going to cut your throat. But even more, oh my God, did I just kill a bunch of Marines, of young guys? No, you did your job right. You did the right thing. So we can delve into so many elements of courage under fire and in the moment. And once again, what was so inspiring about this book is that these guys prevailed. I mean, they overcame these challenges, and that was, to me, in a lot of ways, in my own personal life, the challenges I faced. One of the reasons you asked why I wrote these books during some of the most difficult times of my life, I'm inspired by these people.
Yeah.
If they can do this, then I, from the comfort of my nice house in America, I'm not being shot at. I can deal with whatever comes my way, and I need to get over it, quit whining, man up, honestly, and get it done. And by looking at these stories and watching these guys and writing about them and hearing about them, they inspire me to be stronger, better man because of that. And man and woman, it goes both ways. I mean,
yeah,
a better person, a better soul.
Another inspiring story from Lieutenant Murray is that really made me think of Julius Caesar and Xenophon. So there's they somehow, through sheer bravery and the support of the air support and grit, they managed to make it through the day, and night falls, and they're on the knoll, and Murray, the commanding officer, right? He takes incredible risks, and he goes around personally to the perimeter and inspects every little, a lot of what their cover is like bomb holes where bombs or mortars have hit, and that's the best that they have, and so they're in these bomb holes, and he goes and inspects the perimeter. Can we talk about what he says and his motivations for doing that? I thought that was so interesting as a leadership decision.
And you even have to go back a few hours. On the knoll, you have these craters. He has established a command crater with his unit and his radio operators so that he can call in the close air support. He can have contact with his platoons to know what's going on. And at one point, he's getting all this chatter. We're being overrun. Oh, my God. And he says, knock it off. Stop it. Platoon 1 report. Platoon 2 report. Platoon 3 mortars report. So he's establishing order immediately in this very tense situation. Well, at one point, first platoon's out at the front of the knoll. He loses contact with them. The radio operator is shot. Lieutenant Combs, the lieutenant who later asked to be baptized, is down, takes a huge round to the chest. He has no communication with his first platoon, which is a third of his company at the front, where part of this attack is coming from. It's coming from the front and from the right. It's basically an L ambush. He makes the decision to climb out of his command crater and run down the knoll to find his sergeant to say, you're taking over. Well, incredibly brave, also incredibly, argument can be made to be incredibly reckless, because if he's shot, if you lose your commanding officer in this situation, you're in a world of hurt, because who's going to take over and who's going to coordinate all these arms? He runs out like a football player. He's a football player in high school. Finds Craig Sullivan, who's another veteran. You're in charge, Sully. And Sullivan says, I look up and I see Lieutenant Murray, and I'm going, and I mean, bullets are hitting all around. I'm going, what are you doing here? You're in charge now. Get cover, establish your perimeter. Lieutenant Combs is down, and then he runs back and makes it back. Later at night, it's now dark. The NBA is still out there. They still outnumber. Are they going? And 1-5 was just attacked at night. They were ambushed at night. So the threat of a night ambush is very, very real for this depleted company. So he goes out to see where his men are in the perimeter to make sure that perimeter, and once again, circling the wagons, is intact. And at one point, he finds himself outside the perimeter in no man's land. And it's like, okay, time to get back. I can't really see. And he feels his way to do that. So it was such a mix of personal bravery and common sense and strategic and tactical thought in the moment of this incredible combat with seconds to make decisions, that he earned the Navy Cross, which is just one level under the Medal of Honor. So well earned for his in the moment leadership, calm head, the mix of that personal bravery, along with the strategic and tactical thought of how do we survive this and then move on to the next step? How do we live to see the sunrise? So, once again, I certainly can't see myself doing what he did.
Well, and you talk about at the end of the day when they finally get relieved the next day, there are some guys who have to be marked down as casualties, even though they haven't taken any bullets or anything, because they're just catatonic. They've just lost it. They're just in shock and fear, and I think that goes to show how important the moral courage and the kind of physical presence, the psychological impact of a cool-headed commander like that, going around to all of these men and saying, "All right, you all right? Here's your duty. We're gonna make it. We're gonna make it." And he goes along to every single one of these guys tonight to keep them from crumpling like that, which is just so critical, right? And so that presence of mind is exactly what I think Caesar gives to his troops when there's several very tense moments in the war in Gaul where if he hadn't gone and personally encouraged the various units that were getting just overrun and ambushed by Gauls, the whole thing would have fallen apart. So since we promised it, I want to read one more quote about this kind of clarity that the certainty of death brings, that is so on point with this theme of memento mori that the Stoics talk about, how meditating on your own death can clarify and calm you to live your life better. This is a quote from we've talked about these two guys already, Swan, the point man, and Haney, the guy who's got taken a big bullet to the chest, are there in a little hole together. And I think this is Swan talking, and he says, "When I heard nothing but gooks behind me, nothing but VC behind me, he said, what I thought was behind me, this is before the sun went down, I went, holy F, all of Mike Company is gone. They are going to come over the top here, the bad guys, and I am a dead MF. And I had the deepest fear run through my body at knowing I was out of ammunition and that I was a dead man. And as soon as that went through my body, I was flushed with the calmest feeling I have ever felt in my life." Fascinating. And then he says that Howard Haney next to him kind of had a similar experience that we opened up with. That clarity from just all the worst fear that you could have is like right there. It's happening. And that kind of removes all grounds for fear. And I think if you can kind of summon that moment, this is one of the exercises that the Stoics advise, and Plutarch too in his way, think about vividly your own death, and it can just give you this calm and sense of what's the worst that could happen? Well, that, and you've already faced it. And then you can actually operate and do what you need to do to get yourself out of this situation, because both of these guys end up making it at the end, amazingly.
It's amazing to me to read that. I've never experienced that. I've done a lot of reading like you have. I know that death can be a teacher and a friend, meaning we're all going to die. We don't know when. So that teaches us to appreciate this moment right now, this day, and live it to the fullest and not get caught up in our own mind and our own pettiness, our own worries, or being upset about traffic or the weather. But having said that, I've never experienced what these two men went through. And to read about it's almost opening another door to the afterlife or to another world, and being able to read what they experienced almost in a similar way at a similar time, that calming effect is very enlightening to me. I still don't understand. I'm not in that situation. But it's a glimpse, and it's incredibly valuable. Hopefully, once again, I'm a scribe. I'm writing this stuff down, and I'm experiencing it like you are.
But I think it goes to show how important it is to tell these stories, because if we don't hear about this, if we aren't able to relate to it, then it just happened for them, and maybe they got some encouragement about it in the moment, or really, I mean, these guys are living with PTSD for the rest of their lives. They're waking up in the night hearing machine guns and mortars. But this is a way that we can make it more meaningful, make it more valuable, and make it worthwhile somehow. All the suffering that they went through, redeem it somehow.
Well, and to your credit, you've studied the ancients, and all of this is connected. I mean, these are the ancients. These men of the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, Iraq. They're the ancients. They're the ancients as well. I mean, this fight on the knoll could have been 2,000 years ago. You go the scene in the movie Patton where he goes to a battle between, I think, the Romans and maybe the Corinthians. I don't remember exactly, but he says, of course, he believed in reincarnation. I was here. Yeah. My point was that studying that is so valuable, and we're missing that in our society where people are going off and committing bad deeds. There's two examples of those Army veterans just over New Year's. So to your credit, and why it's so important is to connect all of this together. And I want to be remiss. I want to bring up another veteran, Larry Peters, who was all of, say, 20, was told to take a squad over the knoll and envelop a tree line. This is in the middle of the ambush. He does that. So the squad being, 16 men, something. As soon as he does that, the whole tree line stands up. And it's like, oh my God. And they're being overrun. He, in his own presence of mind, I mean, your first reaction is to run. I mean, go back up the hill. He conducts one of the most difficult maneuvers, as you well know, a tactical retreat under fire, and does so brilliantly. And there's Elliot Rubenfeld talks about how he's in the dirt and he looks up and Peters is standing there with a machine gun, bloodied from shrapnel, and brings these men back in a tactical retreat. And not only that, he's standing up because he is spotting for his men with his machine gun the locations of these Vietnamese who were so well camouflaged, and in so doing so, exposes himself. So he's standing with the machine gun firing where he sees them so the other men can fight as they tactically go back up the hill. And in the end, he, like Father Capodanno, was killed because of his bravery in the moment. Both of them earned the Medal of Honor, as they well should. But without these other men who survived to tell the story, we wouldn't have it. And as a writer of the ancient, 2,000 years from now, maybe someone will pick up this book and talk about it because of you and I knowing how important it is to put this out there as it should be.
But not everybody knew how important it was at the time. Even I think I want to transition to some of the returns that these guys experience. So Sullivan, this guy that you mentioned, sergeant who gets put in charge by Murray, he ends up having an incredible fight, and I think it's him that a mortar lands right next to him and it blows his eye out of its socket. And I take it, and maybe the medic help him put it back in eventually. But here's a guy who's like taking shrapnel and bullets, eye blown out of his socket by mortar. He eventually returns home after his tour is over, and the reception that he gets after making such sacrifices for his country is really striking. There's a really interesting story. I want to let you tell it about his moment of reentry.
So he comes back, and remember, I'm writing about one day in Vietnam. These guys had a 13-month tour of duty, just the one tour. And that's a long time with a lot of bad happening. I mean, Operation Swift was, a number of days, I think maybe 2 weeks. This was just day one. There was a lot of combat after this operation. So he comes back, and first off, he's having trouble with his marriage. So he's not sure what's happening there. He's got a kid, and he's got a doll that he picked up somewhere on his return. And when he gets back, whoever the airline employee rips open the gift wrap package and treats his doll like crap because this person doesn't like these men coming home. I mean, and just at the Air Force Base, the quote hippies and a lot of these people now have regretted what they've done. I mean,
Sure.
it's tomatoes, baby killer, eggs, just horrible reception. And so he's having to endure that. And he had heard a little bit about it. So he wasn't completely blindsided by this reception. Where in World War II, you're getting a ticker tape parade.
Right.
So he's coming home he's like, all right, so I've been through this and now I've got people spitting on me. The person's going to destroy my daughter's presents. And his flights are delayed. And so this group of hippies comes up, they call them hippies, and they surround him in the airport and they're going to beat him up. And Sullivan, he's passed away, but I don't think he was the biggest guy in the world. He got, all right, fine. And he takes off his belt, which has a sharp edge to it. And he's in his Marine. He said, okay, let's go. And at that point, a huge hand touches his shoulder. He looks up and it's Blackjack Mulligan, this wrestler who I had to Google to find out who he was.
But a notable wrestler, it turns out, right?
But a notable wrestler, and Sullivan knew Blackjack Mulligan. He says, boys, I was in the Marines and you call him Sarge. And basically, if you want, let's go. Let's do it right here. And of course, the young men starting this were thoroughly cowed, such to the extent that they, I think, paid for a steak dinner and they ended up drinking and kind of becoming friends in a way. So Sullivan goes through all of that. Thank God, Blackjack Mulligan was there to show him support, and he gets home, and there is a man living in his house with his wife. I mean, his wife had left him, and he had nowhere to go. So talk about stoicism.
Yeah.
Talk about digging deep, faith, complete and utter loneliness after the ordeal of combat in Vietnam, coming home to that. I think he lived with his parents for a while, and another example of incredible courage, bravery, and solidity. He survived it. I mean, he remarried, had a wonderful marriage, and had a wonderful family. Passed away from cancer, more than likely from Agent Orange. Like I said, these men would go on patrol and would just walk through that pesticide every day. But once again, an inspiration that he's not a celebrity. He's not in the news. He's someone we don't know. But what an incredible example for you and I and for all young men and women and everyone to emulate. The hardship that wasn't just one day of battle. It was his entire life up to his own final battle with cancer. So very inspirational, very hard to read, but incredible.
Well, one of the things that you talk about in the introduction to the new volume is this book that you took inspiration from. I forget the name of it. It was a World War II memoir that what was it called again? And tell us a little bit about it.
Well, back when I had first contacted Lieutenant Murray, who retired, I think, as a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, told him what I wanted to do. And this is my second book on Vietnam. He said, you need to write this like Eugene Sledge wrote With the Old Breed. With the Old Breed is probably one of the best real memoirs of real combat in the Pacific during World War II. He was a veteran of Prelude and Okinawa, terrorizing horrible firefight. I mean, there's no glory in war. And Lieutenant Murray said, this is what it was like. You need to write that for Vietnam. And I said, well, Sledge wrote his own memoir. He would write notes and put him into his uniform, not knowing if he would even live. So I'll do my best from what you guys tell me. So that was kind of my mission given to me by Lieutenant Murray. And hopefully with the second edition, and we discussed the first edition at the time was incomplete. I didn't really know that it was incomplete. I had a lot of my own personal tragedies in my own family to deal with. I came back to it about a decade later, looked at it. Why is it? It's very good. Why is it incomplete? And I said, because you're telling the story. You're not letting the men tell the story. And I thought about what Lieutenant Murray said, Lieutenant Colonel, when he retired, about Eugene Sledge. I said, all right, I'm going to go back to the interviews and I'm going to put that voice in there. That's what's made it complete. That's what I think has made it a work I'm very, very, very proud of, because their voice speaks.
And I think that a word that you or maybe Murray used is about Sledge's work is it's unsentimental. And there is a sense that in which people, a lot of people are reading Ernst Jünger today, Storm of Steel, great war memoir. And I recently read Lawrence of Arabia's Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which is both of those works are very literarily accomplished, but they don't try to milk war for emotional value. And I think for that very reason, they present a lot of the facts in the detail without trying to paint it in emotional tones and get rhetorical about the war itself, or about patriotism or heroism. It's just like, it's enough to present the facts. And this is very much what Julius Caesar does, is very much what Xenophon does, that they're just recounting what happened and letting the facts speak for themselves. And in your case, letting the men speak for themselves, I found to be just incredibly moving as a reader, actually much more moving than a kind of varnished, poetic, not that it's not poetic to listen to these guys speak, and a lot of times they're eloquent, but there is something about war that is just cold and horrible. And what you're showcasing is the bravery of the men themselves and the virtues that shine through their actions and through their reflections on those actions. So I have to say that this was an incredibly moving and fascinating book, Swift Sword. And I love war movies. It puts you more in the moment than Platoon, Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket combined. I mean, it's just really, really brings you there. And so I commend you. And I understand that you have another book in the works as well.
Yes. So I spent a lot of time, basically almost 2 decades, on Lions of Medina, my first Vietnam War book, which in the same vein, it's more of a beginning in boot camp through the battle on Medina, where Swift Sword is more in the moment of that 24-hour period. But I wanted to move into historical fiction and basically do my best to put myself in the skin of an ancient hero. And I use the word ancient, meaning that tradition of what that meant. So, and I wanted to do something different and have a lot of angles and a lot of different, not just the standard battle, but the personality. So I did a lot of research and I found this hero named Robert Benoit, who was a French World War I combat pilot. Then in peacetime, between World War I and World War II, a F1 champion in our world, a Grand Prix racing champion, executive with Bugatti in France, celebrity, well-known, won Le Mans in 1937. I don't know, name a celebrity today who's out there, who at an older age, I think of 48, roughly, he was born in 1895, his country's invaded by Germany in 1940. And I think the French get a lot of bad press for, quote, not winning, or people don't understand what they went through and how they fought. So Benoit, who could have sat back and lived as a celebrity and survived the war, says, I'm fighting these invaders. I'm going to do what I can. They won't accept me as a fighter pilot because I'm too old. They won't accept me on the front line. My country's now been invaded. What do I do? he becomes a member of the British Special Operation Executive. You've heard about Winston Churchill creating a fifth column in occupied France because England couldn't invade Germany. These were saboteurs who, I think the quote was, make Europe burn. So you basically go get dropped down into occupied France and you're told to create an underground cell of spies and saboteurs to blow stuff up and to arm the French resistance. Well, Benoit does this. Not only is he close to 50, but everybody knows him. You know, he's well known. So now you're going to go be a secret agent in occupied France? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And what I was able to do was get a lot of research in France, the British National Archives, for his file, and do as much research. There are a lot of books out there. And then to drop myself into his skin and write from the first person perspective. So it's not a nonfiction book, it's historical fiction. But it was quite the experience. I loved doing it. And I think that as we talked about these warriors and these ancients, it's another angle and another way to look about that same tradition of the flawed hero. Mm-hmm. None of us are perfect. Everyone is flawed, but we try to do better. So that book is now finished, and we're looking for an agent, and hopefully it'll be out by the end of the year. Fingers crossed. We'll see how the process goes. Right now, it's called At Full Throttle. That may change. It's had a number of different titles, but the hero, Robert Benoit, Benoist, you can go Google him. If you do that, there'll be some plot spoilers, so I don't know if you want to do that or not. But that's the next work that's coming out, and that work has been in progress for about 6 to 7 years.
Fantastic. Well, I'm excited to read it when it comes out. Anything else that we should talk about, Doyle?
No, I just want to applaud what you're doing. It's important that these stories are told, and that our generation, I have a son who's 27, the young men and women younger than us, those who are older, that people read and reflect and listen to your podcasts, grow, make your soul better. What ancient values, valor, courage, selflessness, humility, hard work, doing the right thing, all those things that people talk about but get lost in our celebrity obsessed culture. It's really, really important now, even more than ever, to read the stories about these real heroes and go back to read Caesar. I mean, go all the way through it to know, because the history teaches us a lot of the lessons we're trying to learn now. Those lessons have been taught. You just have to go find them, listen to them, process them, and make yourself better.
But they're hard to internalize, and that's why we have to keep hitting them over and over and over again, because that's what virtue is. It's
it's a habit, and you have to internalize it, and you have to do it every day. I have a mantra I do every day to stay focused and to be in that zone, to be connected with your soul, and because in our culture with the phones and the computer, and like I said, celebrity or whatever kind of hit that's out there, it's easy to get lost. It's just easy. If you don't stay focused, it's just easy to get lost. And suddenly, who am I? What am I doing? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Faith is vitally important. You saw in Swift's Sword how faith and spirituality came to the forefront when death is at your door. That's a great lesson right there. The old adage that there are no atheists in foxholes. Well, what does that mean? What does spirituality mean? Exploring your soul, and there are a lot of ways to do that. So reading this makes you reflect and helps you focus, helps you process your own life and to make it better for yourself and your loved ones and the world.
Inspiring words. Doyle, I'm enjoyed this so much, and thanks for writing this book and for your other books, and thanks for coming on the show. Where can people find you?
DoyleGlass.com is a great place to start, the website. That'll give you updates on the new book coming out, also more on Swift's Sword and Lions of Medina. I regularly blog about unknown heroes So stories of everyday people, children, elderly doing heroic, selfless, stoic type things. So it's a great place to hear about that. Social media, Facebook and Instagram, Doyle Glass author is a great place just to join that group, and you'll hear about these heroes and read about it and inspire your day and kind of focus your day to learn about other people that have done great things.
Fantastic. And we'll put a link to Swift's Sword. I highly recommend everybody check this book out. It's really, really exceptional. I'll put a link to that in the show notes for people as well. So thanks for coming on.
All right, Alex, thank you. I appreciate it.
Cheers.